Let me tell you what we're going to do. Some of you may have actually already been in the second in the second round of workshops. You might have actually taken Scott Manich. He had a whole section on the Calvin's Company of Pastors. He wrote a book a couple years ago that talks about how John Calvin has pastoral practices, not only how he and the pastors turned Geneva from a medieval Catholic community into a reformed city and society, but also how the pastors themselves were formed and trained and so on. And from what I understand, Scott told you about what happened historically and then did some practical application. So why should I be talking about this? The answer is I'm going to start with the practical application. I read that book. I also read a number of other books in the last 10 years on Calvin's pastoral practices, and I am very convinced that they are extremely important and increasingly important for us today. My thoughts on this are not as well formed. In fact, I'll come right out and say, many of the things I'm going to tell you today I have not done. It's one of the things I'm looking forward to doing, or at least trying to do, by stepping out as the senior pastor of Redeemer. So I won't be preaching every week, I won't be leading the church. And I actually, in some ways, feel like one of the things I'm about to do is try to see some of these ideas realized. So let me tell you from the book, Scott Manich, Calvin's Company of Pastors, Pastoral Care and the Emerging Reformed Church, 1536 to 1609, a great book. But also, here's a couple others. Bruce Gordon's biography of Calvin that he wrote in 2009 that Kevin DeYoung's already mentioned. I mentioned it last night. Here's a book by Matthew Meyer Bolton called Life in God, John Calvin, Practical Formation, and the Future of Protestant Theology. By the way, he's not an evangelical. Still a really helpful book. L.C. McKee wrote a book called John Calvin, Writings on Pastoral Piety. All these books tell you something about how John Calvin formed Christians as Christians. It's what we call discipleship today, but boy, oh boy, oh boy, that's too weak a word. I'm going to use the term formative practices, pastoral formative practices. How did the pastors of Geneva form people into real Christians? Now, I'm going to give you three ideas or three principles that I got out of the reading and trying to understand what Calvin did. And then I'll go back and try to give you some more ideas about how we could apply that ourselves. And I am going to try, I'm watching my clock, because most of my ideas are rather unformed and because a lot of them I have not actually executed on, I feel like rather than spending the entire time pontificating on this, when I don't feel like a pontiff, I'm going to try to see whether we have some time for questions. So we do have a couple roving mics, and if you want to ask me some questions, I'd actually appreciate it. But here's the three ideas. The one thing you'll learn if you study Calvin and his company of pastors and their formative practices in Geneva, one thing you're going to learn is that it takes a lot more than preaching to form Christians. A lot more. The second thing is that the monastic practices that Calvin and Luther both critiqued monasticism as a form of elitism, but they didn't actually critique the practices themselves and actually democratized those practices. Particularly Calvin didn't believe in monasticism in the sense of an elite group of people go off and do all these things. They're the monks and we're just the lay people. He didn't agree with that kind of clericalism. But on the other hand, he actually believed that the things the monks were doing are things that all Christians should do. So in some ways, John Calvin democratized monastic practices. And number three, pastoral formation. That is, pastors need far more intense, ongoing, in-service, lifetime training than they're getting right now. There's the three ideas. So let me go back and talk to you about each one of them and talk about some application possibilities. So the first one is, and this will be more brief, but Christian formation is much more than preaching. It takes a lot more than preaching to form Christians. I would say that looking back on it, when I was younger, I actually did think that preaching could carry more of that freight of Christian formation. And I do think that there is a danger today that people think great preaching is the key. Now, here's a couple of reasons why we may by the way, I'm not saying that we should have any less emphasis on preaching or any lower standards for preaching, but we ought to be having a lot higher standards for everything else we're doing. So I'm not trying to bring preaching down, I'm trying to bring other things up. But the reason we have a tendency to overemphasize preaching, there's a number of reasons. One is, the fact is that the fastest way to draw a crowd is to be a great preacher. So your church grows and you look out there and you feel like a success. And almost anything else you do in ministry does not quickly give you the same aura of success. We do live in a celebrity culture. It's really true. And because of that, really the best preachers are more lionized today than they've ever been. And also revivalism, the background. The evangelicals are very influenced by revivalism, and so am I. And I'm very much a proponent in some ways of revivalism, which is an emphasis on conversion, an emphasis on Christian experience. But revivalism has a dark side. That dark side is that experience matters more than the church. A one-on-one experience between God and the individual is all the emphasis, and the church is not, very often just drops out of the picture. Whereas Calvin, I think, shows us that no, just having a great experience under a great preacher, as dramatic as that can be, and as life-changing as that can be, that doesn't really form a person into, all by itself, into a Christian. That person needs the whole church. And also, by the way, we live in a time of specialization. And there's a tendency more and more in churches for there to be a good preacher, let that person just preach, and then other people run programs. I guess in my background, I started out in a church that was a small church in a small town. The only staff person I had was a one half-time secretary. And I was in a town in which there was not another single licensed psychiatrist, counselor, social worker of any sort. So everyone in town, if you had a problem, you came to a pastor. And in those days, not only did I preach 3 different expository sermons a week, because I did Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, there are 3 different ones, but I did a wedding or a funeral or 2 every month. And when someone died, you spent a week at the house meeting everybody else in their extended family before you did the funeral. And when someone was married, you spent long periods of time doing pastoral, premarital counseling. And you did lots of pastoral counseling, and you did visit everybody in your church, and you would go down to the hospital and visit everybody in the hospital, whether they were part of your church or not. And you did catechism or communicants class with your young people coming up and try to examine whether or not they were believers or not, and calling them to Christ. In other words, I actually, in some ways, had a few years, almost 10 years, in which I lived this idea that preaching is really not the main thing you do. It might be the single most important thing you do, maybe, but basically, it's everything else that you do along with the preaching that actually changes people's lives. So I do see that. I have seen that. I actually think that in our modern culture, the church has sort of lost track of that. So it takes a lot more than preaching to form a Christian. Number 2, let's talk about the pastoral practices for a bit. The monastic practices. What do I mean by that? Well, let me give you 6. These are monastic practices that John Calvin actually took and democratized. He basically took things that the monks were doing and in various ways brought them into church practice so that everybody did them. Here they are. Number 1 was extensive Bible exposition. Now, you already heard a little bit about this, especially if you went to Scott Manich's, I'm sure, his workshop, but you would have heard about this from Kevin too. Do you know that in the medieval Christian church, people didn't sit down during a worship service? They milled around, they often talked to each other while the priests were up there doing their thing. and then they left. John Calvin put seats in, and there was a lot of people saying, this doesn't look like a church, it looks like a schoolhouse. Because people were expected to sit and listen to the sermon. You know, a lot of this church discipline that happened in those days was that during the sermon, people just kept on talking. Because in the medieval worship, you kept on talking because you didn't go there to listen and learn. Calvin changed all that, and not only did he make expository preaching the basis of the Sunday service, and you had to sit down to listen, but actually there was a service of the word every single day. Every day there was a service of the word that took you 5 to 15 verses a day, right through huge books of the Bible. Not only that, Calvin actually had three nights a week or 3 days a week. He did more detailed lecturing at the academy on, passages of the Bible where he went into greater detail, more exegesis and so forth. So everybody in town, and these daily expository preaching services happened all over the town, that you were just immersed in biblical teaching, very much as if you were in a monastery. You were immersed in biblical teaching, and that's one practice. Here's the second practice, was catechesis. Calvin's, on Sundays, there were 4 services. There was a dawn service at 5 a.m. There was where were they here? There was a dawn service at 5 a.m. There was a morning service at 8 a.m. There was a catechism service at 12 noon, and there was an afternoon service at 3 p.m. And the way catechism worked was it was a requisite that you would catechize before you were admitted to the Lord's Supper. And so the catechism service tended to be younger, but not all. It certainly tended to have the children. And the catechism was something that John Calvin wrote. It had 55, I think, parts to it. I'm trying to remember, 55 or so divisions. And he worked through the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, the Lord's Prayer, and the church and sacraments. There were 4 parts. And you had to be catechized in order to receive the Lord's Supper. And so you actually had a service for people who were being catechized. Not everybody showed up at that. That was the service for the people who were in catechism training. And it was just an absolutely critical part of Christian formation. So you had the the constant emphasis on expository preaching. You had catechesis. Thirdly, you had immersion in the Psalms. Now, one of the main monastic practices was that you were immersed in the Psalms. You may know that the Benedictine rule included 7 services a day in which the Psalms were either read or recited or sung. So you got through all 150 Psalms every week. How do you like that? You got through it every week. Calvin came up with a brilliant idea. And what Calvin decided to do was to make the hymnody of the church basically the Psalms. So what he did was he killed 2 birds with one stone. This is a quote here from one of the books I was talking about. He killed 2 birds with one stone when he determined to put the entire Psalter into singable, accessible, but beautiful metrical French. And by putting it into a beautiful, singable, metrical French, you not only made the Psalms very memorizable, but because you would sing through the Psalter at least twice a year, sometimes more, you not only, you killed 2 birds with one stone. You not only made sure that the hymnody that the people were singing was going to be, in a sense, catechizing them, but you were also immersing them in the Psalms. And what Calvin always said was, the Psalms are for the heart. The Psalms are God's prayer book. The Psalms teach you how to pray, teach you how to process every single possible human situation before God in prayer. Do you realize that there's not a single kind of human condition or emotion or situation that you don't find in the Psalter? And it doesn't just tell you about it, it tells you, here's how you process that in prayer. Here's how you handle it before God. So you're singing them every year, at least 2 or 3 times. And in forms, as you know, you remember what you sing better than you remember what you say or what you read, right? You can remember what you read, you remember what you say, better than what you read, and you remember what you sing better than what you say. And especially if it's put in a beautiful metrical form. And so Calvin knew that the monks were immersed in the Psalms. You know, even Thomas Cranmer, we won't go there because we're just talking about Calvin, but Thomas Cranmer, he knew that when he wrote his Book of Common Prayer, that unless people were immersed in the Psalms, and by the way, Thomas Cranmer really, in many ways, followed Calvin in trying to democratize the monastic practices because he knew that they were ways of really forming people head and heart. He has you go through the Psalms every month. Calvin had it every couple of, 2 or 3 times a year. But the point was, immersion in the Psalms is the third monastic practice that everybody went through. So there was expository preaching, catechesis, immersion in the Psalms. Number 4, the Lord's Supper was very prominent, not just in worship, but in the way pastoral formation and Christian formation was done. Some of you may know that Calvin argued with, as Calvin got older, he more and more came to believe that you should have the Lord's Supper every week. And I do not want to be talking about that here. Don't ask me a question about it either, because we don't want to open that issue up. It's an important issue, but Calvin, you can see as he's writing his Institutes, and he went through several editions, he got more and more to the place where he said, you really ought to have the Lord's Supper each week. But the council never went there. The town council didn't believe it. And partly as a result of that, they had the Lord's Supper 4 times a year. But the Lord's Supper was never just something you did in the worship service. Never. Because it happened 4 times a year, there was all sorts of things that happened around that. The communion season was a time in which the pastors would get together and they would do self-examination. They would look at each other. They would talk to each other about how they were doing spiritually. There would be more, the people would be asked to get ready for the Lord's Supper by looking at themselves. And the elders might be visiting the people more, getting them ready. In other words, pastoral care was linked to the Lord's Supper 2 ways. One, of course, is catechism. Catechesis brought you to the place where you admitted to the Lord's Supper. So the Lord's Supper, in a sense, was the climax of your period of catechism. But it also was a way for people to regularly re-examine themselves and renew their commitment to the Lord and examine themselves and make confession and grow in grace. So pastoral practice and pastoral care was linked to the Lord's Supper. What was happening in the worship service was linked to the way in which people were doing pastoral care. Number 5, a daily office. Now, this isn't very well known, but John Calvin, in his catechism, because the catechism was given to families, because the children very often were catechized by the parents, John Calvin also actually put in there a set of prayers to pray. He believed that you should pray 4 or 5 times a day. He believed you should pray when you woke up, when you ate, when your morning breakfast. You should pray when you started work or study. You should pray the midday. You should pray at supper. You should pray when you went to bed. And what he actually did was he wrote not so much prayers like Thomas Cranmer, here's what you pray at those times, but he actually gave you sample prayers, but actually called for what we would call today a daily office. And he also gave the families a brief liturgy for when they were worshiping and when they were catechizing their children. And the liturgies had the Apostles' Creed, Lord's Prayer, Scripture reading, and confession of sin. And so he actually created, in a sense, a relatively informal, especially compared to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, a relatively informal daily office of prayer during the day and family religion. In all those ways, very much like the monastic practices. And lastly, accountability. Kevin DeYoung last night talked about what we call the consistory. And on Thursdays, Calvin and the elders met to essentially exhort people who've been brought before them who are having, put it this way, pastoral issues or difficulties. They talked to people who were not coming to church. They would be brought before the consistory. People who were perhaps propagating doctrine that wasn't true or right. He would talk to people whose marriages were falling apart, whose sexual practice and behavior needed exhortation. They worked on interpersonal disputes. especially between families, between business colleagues when they had a falling out. All these people were brought before the consistory. And a lot of you are right away saying, church discipline, church discipline. Yeah, they could do church discipline. That was a little interesting since, don't forget, this was a state church, and we'll get back to that in a second. But generally, they just exhorted them. They just exhorted them. They urged them to do this or to do that, to repent, to forgive. And therefore, there was real pastoral accountability. And in all those ways, it was like being in a monastery, but they, in a way, turned the entire town into a place where the monastic practices were being practiced. Let me just add one more, or two more, at least. If you take these things, the huge emphasis on exposition, so you're just immersing your people in the Scripture. Catechesis, where you are systematically training them in theology and piety. Immersion in the Psalms, where you're saturating not just their heads but their hearts in the Psalter, getting them to pray the Psalms, getting them to sing the Psalms. If you look at the using the Lord's Supper not just as an important part of worship, but part of pastoral care. If you look at I'm leaving out one. If you look at the daily office of prayers during the day, so you pray more than once a day, and you also have family religion. And then if you look at the pastoral accountability in all these ways, our modern churches fall short, way short. A discipleship program or a small group Bible study, a good expository sermon, a good worship service comes far short of these things. Those things do not form people like all this does. But we do have to keep a couple quick things in mind. Calvin was working in a state church. You know, if you didn't go to church, you were fined. It was a state church. And therefore, people said, well, how did Calvin do evangelism? How did they get non-Christians to come to church so you could preach the gospel to them? It was very simple. You just, you threw them in jail until they went to church. You could try that in your hometown, but it might not work. Or they didn't actually do jail, but they did find people, they could exhort people and that sort of thing. And therefore, whatever else you do, if you can't just read Calvin's Geneva into your situation today, because you've got to add a lot of the practices that churches have done that we call evangelistic. You have to have evangelistic services. You have to have ways of reaching out to non-believers. You have to have ways of following up and discipling brand new Christians, and so forth. So you have to add that to all the practices. And this leads me to ask you these questions. If you look at those formerly monastic practices democratized by the reformers, do you have an equivalent? Is there anything in your own church's life that has an equivalent? I mean, we obviously can adapt things. These are not things that the Bible necessarily says this is exactly what you have to do in church. So you can adapt, you can accommodate, you can innovate. But my question is, do you have anything like these things in each of these cases? Do you have a way of uniting people in common prayer in their daily life? Do you have a way of immersing people in the Psalms so their prayer life and their heart is actually being given a vocabulary to approach God? Are you exposing people to expository study of the Word of God like that? Do you have anything like catechesis, where you really are getting people into theology and giving it to most of your people? In Calvin's case, all of your people. Nobody was admitted to the Lord's Supper unless you'd been through catechesis. Do you have anything like this? Have you got pathways? Have you worked out how a person moves from first getting into the church right through all those practices? Have you got ways of doing that? We need to find ways of doing it. Ask me about this, please. I'm obviously exhorting you, and I'm actually saying that in our own situation at Redeemer, we are realizing that we've fallen pretty short in a lot of these areas. Now let me talk to you a little bit about the last thing. I'm looking at my, I think I'm going to allow you enough time. Remember, the third principle was Calvin shows us that pastors need far more intense in-service, ongoing, lifetime training than they're getting. we load all that into seminary, and then we get out there, and you're very fortunate if you occasionally come to a conference like this. You're very fortunate if you might have some kind of local ministerial association or a network that you get together with. But let me tell you what Calvin did. Maybe now, if you were, again, if you were at Scott's workshop, you would have heard about this, but I'll just take 2 minutes on it. Every Friday, Calvin called together what he called the Venerable Company of Pastors. And these were all the pastors, not only in the city of Geneva, but actually even in the environs. So it was really Geneva and the environment, what we would call the suburbs, but that wouldn't be fair because that's not what those things were. But anyway, all the pastors in an area, probably 20, 30 pastors. And every Friday, this is what happened. From 8 o'clock in the morning to 9:30, they had what was called their public conference. I have no idea what the French term was, but I'm not even going to try. The public conference. And what you did for that hour and a half was some pastor basically did an exposition. It wasn't so much a full sermon. It was a little bit more like an exposition, the basis for a future sermon. So what they did was they worked through whole books of the Bible. Each week, a new pastor would come and give an exposition. They did their exegesis, and they presented their exposition. It was kind of like a sermon, but it was more like the bones of a sermon without a whole lot of the other accoutrements you'd put in. And there would be one person who preached for maybe 30 minutes, and then there would be one pastor who was designated to respond, to add, to correct, to make suggestions, to maybe challenge the interpretation of that passage, or to affirm it. And then other pastors would chime in, and usually Calvin would get up at the very end and give his thoughts on the text, and this was open to the public. So the pastors got together, and they in a sense did practice preaching. What was the purpose of this? Because maybe a year from now or 2 years from now, they would all work through that book. But they were working through the book now, making sure they were on the same page in the way in which they interpreted the book. Learning how to do preaching, in a sense, was practice preaching. And it was open to the public. So generally the most, the more, there's always Christians who are the most interested in growing. And so probably more of the eager and more mature lay people would show up. So on Friday mornings from 8 to 9:30, all the pastors got together and took turns preaching through parts of the Bible and then responding to one another and doing critique, and Calvin would get up and everybody would be there then. At the end of the conference, from 9:30 to noon, they went into private. In the private, sometimes they did a little bit more sharp correction or critique of the sermon than they might have done in public. But then secondly, in the 9:30 to 12 noon, they did many, many other things. They did pastoral cases, where they would take a case study of some pastoral problem and they would work through it. Sometimes they actually did have people do some teaching on some area of theology that they were working through, trying to figure out, well, what do we believe about this? They also did brotherly critique, which was not formal discipline, but they called it sharpening. They regularly got together and talked to each other about how they thought one another were doing as preachers, as pastors, as Christians. And they did examine new pastors in order to determine whether or not they should be ordained ministers. And there was just general mutual theological and ethical encouragement. Plus, 4 times a year, I already mentioned this, along with the communion season, they did particular self-evaluation, where they looked at each other. Today we'd call it peer review. Today we'd call it a 360. But what it really was pastors sitting down with each other and telling each other very frankly how they thought they were doing in the pastoral office. This happened every week, and of course those particular times of peer review happened 4 times a year. Does any pastors in this room experience anything like that? No. If you're a Presbyterian, you can actually see in what Calvin did. This is the historic This is the headwaters of the presbytery meeting. This is where the presbytery meeting came from. But everybody knows, even in the best Presbyterian churches, that this is not what presbytery meetings look like anymore. All we do is the business part, partly because we don't meet every Friday from 8 until noon. And if you're not in a Presbyterian situation, if you're in a Baptist situation, congregational, independent churches, things like that, those of us who are in more connectional, traditional denominations, when we do get together, it's all formal. It's nothing like this. We don't work on our preaching. We don't preach through books of the Bible together. We don't work on our unity of doctrine and our purity of doctrine and the quality of our preaching. We don't do that. We don't sit around and do brotherly critique. We don't do that. We don't know each other that well, frankly, and we're too busy with all the logistics. But those of you who are not in traditional connections, you don't get anything like this either. And I would say, going forward, I'm not sure how we are going to survive as the culture gets more hostile. We're going to see more and more people who look like their ministry is doing well go down, just walk away, or fall into doctrinal error, or come under the pressure of the culture to change traditional biblical doctrine, or people who are going to succumb to various sorts of temptations because we don't do anything like this. Last thing I'll say, if you actually do read these books I'm talking about, which you should, you will wince at times at the overreach. Very often, even within, let's just say, even at the time, and you have to remember we're talking hundreds of years ago in Europe, even for their time, very often Calvin and his company of pastors were authoritarian. They could get upset. By the way, here's a good example. One of the things in the Scott Manish book, I remember there was one of the things they discouraged was giving your baby, when your baby was coming to be baptized, you would name the child, and they discouraged, they wanted you to give people biblical names, give the kids biblical names, instead of the names of the Catholic saints, because it was traditional to give your kids the name of the saints, and so the company of pastors was saying, no, give your kids biblical names, not the names of the saints. And there was one guy that was a little on the authoritarian side, and he was up there conducting the baptism, and his parents came forth, and they said, what is the name of this child? And I think they said, his name is Claude, which is one of the Catholic saints. And so the guy picked the kid up in his arms and said, no, his name is Abraham, and baptized him and changed the name right on the spot. Or something like that. I forget what the name was, but he changed the name. He just refused. And during that Friday company of pastors meeting, some people said to him, that might have just been a little over the top. So they could be pretty authoritarian. And yet, and we're independent. Even those of us who think of ourselves as strong evangelicals, we are creatures of our culture. Our culture has taught us that we should be independent, we should be free, we should be able to, we resent the intrusiveness of a tight community and accountability. Nevertheless, there are abuses. I'm trying to tell you that. There is authoritarianism. And we have to be very, very wary of that, because people receive this worse than they ever have. If people back in those days sometimes felt that the company of pastors was overbearing, we really are going to have to be very careful and sensitive and gracious in the way which we do it now. But I don't know going forward that we can do well unless we do what Calvin did, which was to democratize the monastic practices and to create an extremely tight company of pastors who got lifelong, intense training, and I'm not sure that we're going to be able to make it unless we do something along those lines. That's all. You were going to say, well, we'll lay it out. No, I'm not. My time's up. At least if I'm going to get some questions. I would rather you ask me some questions and push me where I should be going next with this, or where you should be going next with this. So where are the mic guys? Okay, Kenny's got a mic. Okay, somebody? Sure, let's go. We got time.
My question, as I reflect through what you've said, breaking from the point about over-authoritarian, it sounds a little top-heavy, and I'm thinking about the layman. I'm thinking about churches that I've been in that are really dynamic. The laymen are strong, and I wonder if you have any comment on that. Is there something that went over my head?
No, by the way, for example, in the consistory, remember I've talked about the consistory? That was on Friday. John Calvin met, and it was really with other elders. They were lay people. So generally, the people who came before the consistory for exhortation, it was really elders. The elders were over various wards of the city, and the elders were extremely involved in pastoral care. So yeah, it's top-heavy. I was trying to, the company of pastors was the pastors, but you're right, thank you. If you read the books, you'd see that it wasn't all pastoral. But you know what? I wonder whether or not Calvin was as sensitive to what the Bible says about lay ministry as he should have been. So I think that's fair to question. I'm not trying to idealize him. I'm just trying to say I was smitten by the paltry nature of the way in which Reformed Christians reading that book, but I don't want to just pick it up and just put it down. So it's a great question. Somebody else over here.
I'm a Southern Baptist, and the idea of catechism is a pretty new idea to me.
Okay.
I do it with my children, but as far as teaching it at a church, could you maybe just go through what that would look like and how you would implement that to a church that's not currently doing it?
Sure. Well, big subject. If you anybody who's done a little study of church history realizes that everybody wrote their own catechism. I've had some people say, "Why do we need a new catechism?" And that's a little crazy, because basically catechism was the way in which you instructed people. So if you're a pastor, you tended to write your own catechism anyway. You didn't rely on other catechisms. Actually, Heidelberg, Westminster, those are great catechisms, and you can't ignore them. They're too good and they're too time tested. But there's really no reason why you couldn't write your own. What's great about it is catechisms, unlike modern, how do I say it? Modern evangelicals do Bible study, which is great. I think I mentioned this yesterday when I was being interviewed with Colin. John Calvin, as important as it was for him to get right through the Bible, right? He just studied right through biblical books. But he wrote the Institutes, which was originally essentially a catechism, in which he was summarizing Christian doctrine. So all I'm saying is that you've got to find two things. I'm glad you asked the question about catechism. Two things is you've got to find a way. If you want to adopt somebody else's catechism, great. If you want to write your own, maybe better in some ways, where you are summarizing the body of Christian doctrine. Make sure you hit doctrine, like Apostles' Creed or whatever. Make sure you hit piety, Lord's Prayer, or whatever. Make sure you hit ethics, which is 10 Commandments, Sermon on the Mount, or whatever. And you hit church. What does it mean to be in the church? What is the church about? And those four things. And make sure you immerse people in that. Have something for little kids, have something for teenagers, have something for adults. I'm just saying we tend in the evangelical church to let people study the Bible, but we stay away from doctrine. We stay away from summaries of what the Bible teaches. Here's the other thing to say about catechism. Boy, you're all ready to come. Look at you. I'll never get to all of you, so I'll try to not be so, verbose. But right now the culture's catechizing your kids. So, for example, let's just say a 14-year-old kid raised in your church, and by the way, they're out there now, raised in your church, went to Sunday school, went to youth group, whatever. One day, the kid says to his mother or father, if two gay people love each other, I'm not sure what's wrong with that. And the parents melt down, oh my goodness, what happened here? Didn't you go to church? And you might actually take the kid to what the Bible says. The kid's eyes are going to glaze over. I'll tell you why. Here's three catechism, here's three statements that the world is getting to your kid through social media, through almost every TV sitcom, through almost every movie, through almost every piece of music. And here are the three. Number one is you've got to be true to yourself. You got to be true to yourself. Number two, in the end, you've got to do what makes you happy. You just have to. And number three, nobody has the right to tell anybody else what's right or wrong for them. Okay? Does that sound familiar? It's at the heart of the last movie you've watched. It's probably in there or behind it. And so the kid's being catechized by these things. And so whatever your catechism is, it has got to deconstruct that. So our catechism has got to deconstruct the world's catechism. Therefore, that's the reason why I'm okay with writing new ones. Because the older catechisms were written to counteract the narratives, the non-believing narratives of a different world. Doesn't mean that they're not great. They are terrific and wonderful. But that's the reason why it's okay to write new catechisms. People always used to. Okay, let's go back and forth, and I'll try to be less verbose. Yes, over here.
Hi, Dr. Keller. I'm in the PCA, and I just wanted to see any advice or how you would encourage us to pursue the community that the company of pastors had amongst the presbytery. Like, how would you go about starting that?
Well, I think the answer is that the members, it depends on how geographically spread out your presbytery is. That's the whole thing. But generally, the people who are within easy access to each other, not too far away, you ought to just simply form the company. Just do it. Go look what Calvin did and adapt it and just start doing it. You might not be able to do it start at least every month. But generally, the real problem is most of our denominations who are Presbyterian are not, we don't have enough people so that our presbyteries are small. And so there's plenty of presbyteries where people fly to presbytery because they're that far away. So find at least 4 or 5 other pastors within the, and then, by the way, you could, for this sort of thing, you probably could add somebody maybe from another denomination or two, as long as they were really, really aligned with you, and try it out. Let's go back and forth. Over here.
I'm wondering if you had an experience of a pastor taking you in, and maybe a story why that was significant or meaningful to you, what you or we could glean from it. Thanks.
No, wait. So you're asking me if I had an experience of someone pastoring me like this?
Did someone take you in?
No. That's a nice, easy thing. I mean, it's a sad answer, but at least it's short. No. Let me be honest. Us baby boomers didn't look for it. There's an arrogance about us that we felt, and I have to say, the difference between my parents and myself culturally is far greater than the distance between myself and my children. They would say the same thing. I mean, I'm still obviously another generation, but there was some enormous gulf that happened in the 60s. There was a huge change in the culture, and most of us my age didn't look for mentors because we didn't think anybody had anything to teach us. It was just arrogant. So I'm not saying, it's not really sad. But the answer is no, I didn't. I was much more of a loner, and a lot of baby boomer pastors learned to be loners, and the ones that survive look admirable, but it's not necessarily true. Over here.
Dr. Keller, we've been hearing a lot about the Benedictine option as well as what you've been talking about just today.
Yeah.
And I'm sensing, is there a way that our churches, can we kind of change them to be more of that fortress, or maybe not fortress, but countercultural part of the world?
Okay. I was wondering when somebody was going to bring up the book, The Benedict Option, because I've been talking about, and I do know this is true, that the reformers did think that monasticism had some good things and was trying to say, our churches are too porous, the people in them are too much like the rest of the world. If we're really going to form them to be different than the world, we're going to have to use these practices because they create thicker communities and they're more formative. Okay. Now, I have not read The Benedict Option. I got the book the day I ordered, the day it came out. I got it. I haven't read it, so I can't speak to it. I would say, from what I can tell from all the controversy about it, that Rod Dreher is certainly right about saying we need to democratize these practices and bring them into our churches. Now, what I can't tell, because I haven't read the book, is does that mean withdrawal or not? See, in other words, I would agree probably with anything he says about thickening the formative practices of our churches enormously. I'm not sure what he says about what does that mean about our political involvement, evangelistic involvement. You know, what does that mean about how we engage the world? I don't know. Until I read the book, I have no idea. So I'm not pro or anti the Benedict option until I read his book and find out exactly what he's saying. But at least the formative part, my guess is what I said, that's the reason why you asked me the question, is I'd be very much agreement to say our churches are not really changing our people. They're inspiring them, but they're not forming them. They're not that different. And that's what Rod, I think, is saying. Over here.
How do we protect ourselves when putting these and democratizing these monastic practices without falling back into the idea of a works-based salvation?
Yes, legalism. How do you do that? Well, no, you're right. When you're preaching the gospel, you always have to say, you know, Martin Luther said, and he actually did say this somewhere, I finally found it. He says, we're justified by faith alone, but not by faith which is alone, or remains alone. So he says, you have to say that though the practices in no way contribute to your salvation, the practices will be something you will want to pick up and do because you'll want to be like the one who saved you by grace. You're going to want to be like Jesus. If you don't want to be like Jesus, I'm not sure you were saved by grace. I mean, that's a hard dialectic to get across to most people. Because if you push grace, some people say, well then, you know, why should I work that hard at all this stuff? And if you push the work, then people say, well, you're not saved by grace. But some of you know this because I've used it. When I was evangelizing a woman who eventually became a Christian, but she wasn't a Christian at the time, and she was saying she'd gone to church, and she'd always been told you're saved by being a good person. And she said, but in your church, you're saying you're saved by complete grace. Grace alone, nothing to do with anything I do. Doesn't matter how much I pray, doesn't matter how good I am, no matter what I do, I can't say I'm saved by grace. And she says, I don't know why more churches don't preach that. And I said, well, why do you think they don't preach it? And she says, I'll tell you why. She says, if I'm saved by my works, then God can't demand anything from me. It's like I'm a taxpayer, I have my rights. You know, I've put in my, you know, I've paid my dues. So you can't just ask anything of me. She said, but if I was really believed I was saved by grace, well, there'd be nothing he couldn't ask of me. I have to be completely given to him. I have to do everything for him, and I would want to. And people are threatened by that. And I looked at her and I said, and you're not a Christian yet? I said, she says, no, she was scared of it. But you know, a lot of people would say, well, if I'm saved by grace, you know, what incentive do I have to be holy? And her answer was, if when you say, if I'm saved by grace, what incentive do I have to be holy? It means the only incentive you can imagine is fear. The only incentive for holiness is fear. That shouldn't be it. So you do always have to preach the gospel in such a way that people say, tell me what to do, and I really want to do it. But it's motivated by grace. So that's always a problem. No doubt about it. You're going to have to do that all the time. Otherwise, a pride in works righteousness comes in and say, look at where I'm getting through. I'm doing all this stuff. So you're right. It's a problem. You just have to tackle it like that. Preach the gospel more deeply, or at least more extensively. So, good point, though. Yes.
I grew up in a Dutch Reformed culture where we still sing the Genevan tunes. We still do a lot of the monastic practices that you've brought out of Calvin. Yeah. We've appealed to Geneva for that. Mm-hmm. But a lot of our people don't want it anymore. They struggle to see why we should do it. My question to you is, how are you going to convince your people that they should do this? And what would I say?
We're Americans, you know. Some of us are. But and Americans just always want to do the new thing. So I won't have that much trouble because they haven't done it before. Since they haven't done it before, they'll say, oh, this is new. And of course, for Americans, it's new, so it's great. And your problem is it's not new, so it's terrible. See, so they may be Dutch, but they're Dutch American, so it's terrible. You're actually going to have to say, first of all, you ought to say that we're probably more formed by these we have probably been more formed by this than you think. That other places that don't use this, that there's a tendency to just pick up the spirit of the age. You have to make the case for why it continues to be a good thing. But the other thing is to add a couple things that they haven't seen before that are new, then they'll feel like, oh, this is cool. I know that's, you don't want to pander to that, but you do have to try to make some use. So by the way, this is also, James K.A. Smith, who's always talking about the importance of liturgical worship for formation, right? All of his books are saying, and he's right about this in general, that you're not changed simply by teaching people things, but by the imagination being captured and the affections of the heart being changed. And he's right. So he says liturgical worship. But the same thing, people are always saying to me, I was raised in a liturgical church, and it's not a magic bullet. And there are people in the liturgical church that say, I want something new. I've got one of my wife's siblings, partly because she was raised in a more traditional church, just doesn't want traditional worship at all. She feels much more liberated by more contemporary worship. So, I think you have to be careful. I don't think the formative practices are tied to one way of doing worship, even though I do think you have to take great care. Like I said, the Lord's Supper is very important. But you notice I didn't quite go with Jamie Smith on this. I didn't say it's got to be liturgical, because it depends on how liturgical. I would say change things up and make good in some ways so people do feel like we're moving forward, and make a good case for the parts that you're keeping. That's always good leadership. Good leadership says, here's what we're going to change, here's what we're going to keep, here's why we're going to keep it, here's why we're going to make a change. You have to make the case. So let's keep going here, just to get a couple more. That's a great question too, over here.
Tim, I'm an Anglican pastor, St. Stephen's Church in Swickley, Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I know it.
Oh, great. We have a small group community along the lines of what you've described, with daily office, accountability group, spiritual direction, and so on. There's been a lot of fruit from that, but there have been two counter challenges.
Okay.
One is it can breed a clericalism of the laity, where you have the super spiritual lay people who sign up for this small group program. And so that's one issue. The other is a time issue of how much people are committing to these kinds of practices, which actually eats away at their missional commitment to the outward emphasis in the community.
Well, I'd have to sit down and look at exactly how much time it took, but the first part, the super spirit, this is what Calvin was trying to get away from. He didn't really want it to be optional. He wanted everybody do it. And that gets rid of the feeling that some people are elite. I mean, that's the whole problem with monasticism, is you have a bunch of elite people who are really being religious for the rest of us. And so it's difficult, because I know in America, you can't, and it's very hard to be, people don't want to be regimented, they want to have options. And so the people who opt for this will end up maybe developing some pride. It's a problem. I mean, listen, I've told you, I want to learn from your questions rather than, there are some places where I could give you a lot of answers in subjects I think I know more about. I don't feel like I know as much about this. The second thing, though, about the time, you do have to make the case that mission is a formative practice. And so you have to make time for it. And if you don't have time for mission, you need to make sure that whatever your formative practices are, they're well balanced. For example, you can't have someone who says, I get through all the Psalms every day. So I'm not going to work, and I'm not spending any time with my children. I mean, that's ridiculous. But I'm saying you wouldn't want to just take one practice and drill down on it and leave all the others go. So you do have to make the case. And I try to say something at the very end, that Calvin didn't do the mission thing because it was a state church sort of situation. But mission is one of the formative practices. So you just have to go back and say, if you don't have time for mission, then you're giving too much time to these practices and not enough time to this. That's how I would start to argue. I got time for a couple more, but I'm learning as much as you are, by the way, which maybe isn't what you wanted. Maybe you wanted the expert. I could have kept talking until the time was up and made you think I was smarter than I am about this subject, but now I'm revealed to be what I am. Yes?
Given that Calvin operated within a state-run context,
Yes.
he could find people in order to have them engage in these number of things.
It did happen.
In the absence of that today, which I'm sad for, just kidding. It's
great
all
moneymaker.
based on spiritual hunger, and we
Yeah.
want more engagement. My question is, as a minister, as a pastor, how do you deal with spiritual apathy and move people to spiritual hunger so that they want to engage
Right.
in these variety of things?
Well, now, I think it'd be fair to say that Calvin didn't do the fining and they didn't do the civil penalties very often. That's what the consistory was for. If you read the minutes of the consistory, it's some of it's pretty hilarious, but they were constantly bringing people before it who clearly just weren't engaging. So even though I was just saying to the brother over here that they required everyone to do the practices so that there wasn't an elite, the fact was there was always a percentage of people who just didn't do it. They just wouldn't do it. And so they were constantly being brought up in front of the elders. But mostly what they got were exhortations. They did not get, they really didn't get fined or slammed. And it wasn't as totalitarian as it sounds. There was always the danger of that if you were really flagrant. But by and large, there's people they're constantly exhorting, and they're coming back all the time, and they're not getting to church. They're not doing this. They're not doing that. So there was apathy. And it was met with loving exhortation and a recognition that a certain percentage of people will just not, you just have to pray that God lights a fire under them. Yes, over here.
Yeah, thank you. Regarding some of the things you mentioned today, psalmody, a daily office of prayers, and catechism, how could they develop or contribute to our thought of family worship, and what could that look like together?
Yeah, well, the family worship, I want you to know that my sons completely rebelled against family worship, and we stopped. And today, they're all in their 30s now. If you ask them, since they're all professing Christians, people say, what did your parents do right that helped you embrace the faith? They'll usually say they stopped family worship. I've heard them say that because they hated it. And they were, and this is where you do have to be sensitive to people's different capacities and aptitudes. They just couldn't stand it. Now, in their case, now think about this. These are pastors' kids. And they go to church a lot. And they go to a lot of Christian activities. And they felt like, one more? And so we sat there and we said, okay, in a way they are being formed in ways that other kids were not being. They were exposed to teaching. They were exposed to the gospel. They were exposed to... We felt like we realized that we were being a little wooden about it. And so we did allow, and we stopped it, however. Calvin would say the catechism was a lot of fun to do, frankly, with kids. The Psalms are a lot of fun to do with kids. It should be, to me, the key is brevity. The key is brevity. In fact, when Kathy and I finally broke through and started praying with each other every night, which we have now for years and never missed, we also found the key was brevity. That every time we tried to do it before, we kind of made it a little too officious, a little too, rigorous, and we took it too seriously. We just did it quickly, and I think that was a big part of it. But don't forget, by the way, I'm not saying how you get people into the Psalms. I mean, Kathy and I wrote a book called Songs of Jesus, which is through the Psalms, every single verse in 1 year. And that was, I do know some people that are actually, they did this once, and they love it, but now they're going to use it every year, but they're not going to make it the main thing they do. Because, if you can do it in like 10 minutes. And so I know some people say, that's how I'm getting through the Psalm. I'm getting through the Psalms once a year. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it. That's all I'm trying to say. And you do need to be flexible. And now I think I need to say, time's up. Let me close in prayer. And as soon as we're done, I'm going to dinner and you're going to dinner too. Let me pray. Thank you, Father, for giving us a chance to talk about how we, in a digital culture, in a post-Christian culture, can form people into Christ-likeness. We do know that in the early church, we do know during the Reformation, that you did work, always through very imperfect people and very imperfect practices. They never worked perfectly at all, and yet great fruit was born in those ages of church history. We pray that you would find us ways to do that now, because we really are. We have for many years been blessed with an awful lot of Christian influence in our society, and that's going away. In your providence, we ask that you would show us how we can continue to raise up sons and daughters and men and women who are not conformed to the world, but are transformed through the renewal of their minds by the gospel. So help us. I hope that this hour we spent together was provocative in some small but important ways in everyone's life, everyone who heard. And I pray that you would work with what little we came up with here today, but that you would work with that, and it would be a seed that be planted and bear much fruit in our lives and in the lives of the church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.